Marcus Ellison was 39 years old, and for 11 years he had been the quietest man in every room his wife entered. He drove a 10-year-old Tahoe with a cracked dashboard he'd never gotten around to fixing. He wore the same 4 shirts on rotation and bought his work boots from the same store where he'd bought his first pair at 19. Her colleagues called him the silent type, the way people say it when they mean something smaller. Vivian never corrected them. She had been planning her exit for 14 months. He would learn that later, from the forensic accountant his attorney hired, in a report that read like the instruction manual for a controlled demolition. $47,000 moved in small, patient increments from their joint accounts into a Cayman-registered holding company whose paperwork bore Vivian's maiden name and the signature of a man named Dorian Hecht, who was listed as her chief operating officer and who, on a Tuesday in March, had parked his silver Range Rover in Marcus's driveway for 3 hours while Marcus was supposed to be in a site meeting across town. What Vivian did not know, what she had never thought to ask, not once in 11 years, was what Marcus had been doing at that site meeting, or any of the dozen others that preceded it. She had no idea who he had been talking to. She had no idea what he had already signed. What happened next would dismantle everything she thought she had built, and leave her standing in the middle of it, holding papers that had already lost their power. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in low and amber through the garage windows, and Marcus Ellison stood at his workbench with a belt sander in both hands, smoothing the edge of a credenza he'd been building for the past 6 weeks from reclaimed white oak. The wood had come from a demolished schoolhouse in Gaffney, South Carolina. He'd driven down himself, loaded the boards into the truck bed, and sorted them in his garage by grain and width over a single quiet Saturday. The credenza was not for a client. It was for no one in particular. It was something he built the way he breathed, steadily, because stopping felt like a kind of dishonesty. His grandfather had told him once, sanding the hull of a small boat in a workshop that smelled like cedar and mineral spirits, "Wood will show you every mistake you've ever made. That's not a punishment. That's an education." Marcus had been 11 years old and hadn't understood it then. He understood it now. He set down the sander when he heard the coffee maker beep inside. Charlotte, North Carolina, in late October, had a particular quality of stillness in the mornings, the kind that sat between the houses on their quiet street in Plaza Midwood, and made everything feel held in place. He had bought this house 12 years ago, before he met Vivian, before the company existed in anything more than a folder on his laptop and a handshake with a man named Warren Gale, who believed in the same kind of infrastructure nobody saw until it failed. He had sanded these floors himself, relaid the bathroom tile on a long weekend, rebuilt the back deck board by board with Douglas fir that had seasoned in the garage for a year before he touched it. The house was his in the way that things become yours through the labor of them. Vivian came into the kitchen in a charcoal blazer already buttoned, her heels precise on the tile, her hair pressed and finished. She was 37 and still moved through rooms like she expected to be photographed. He had loved that about her once. She kissed his cheek, not his mouth, and poured coffee into a travel mug, and spoke briefly about a client dinner on Thursday she'd need the car for because hers was going in for service. She spoke to the refrigerator more than to him. Something about it was practiced, the way a person practices something they want to look effortless. He had met her 11 years ago at a project management conference in Raleigh, a breakout session on vendor coordination where she'd sat 2 seats over and disagreed with the presenter in a way that was careful and correct. She'd been working in commercial real estate at the time, organized and precise and funny in a dry way that he appreciated. They were married 14 months after that first conversation. She left commercial real estate 3 years into the marriage to start her own company, a boutique consulting firm called Viridian Group. And Marcus had listened to every version of the pitch and the plan, and had believed in it genuinely, because she was genuinely capable, and that had been the truth of her that he'd fallen in love with. He watched her leave. He watched the way her hand held the travel mug with a grip that was slightly too tight, the knuckles just slightly pale. Her phone stayed face down on the counter until she picked it up. He didn't say anything about it. 3 days later, on a Wednesday, he came home from a site inspection 2 hours ahead of schedule and found a silver Range Rover parked 1 block over. Not in his driveway this time, but close enough that it registered. He noted the plate number. He took a photograph with the unhurried calm of a man inspecting a structural joint that looked fine, but that something in him said wasn't. His hands didn't shake. Marcus was not a man who moved on instinct. He was a structural engineer by training and a construction project manager by practice, and his entire profession was built on the discipline of verifying what you thought you knew before you acted on it. He had spent 15 years managing the assembly of things that other people would live and work inside, which meant that guessing had consequences, and consequences had weight, and weight had to be accounted for in the design. So he started at the beginning. He pulled his own financial records first, the joint account statements going back 18 months. And he sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Vivian was at a brunch she'd mentioned twice, as if she wanted him to remember it. And he sorted through the statements with the same methodical attention he brought to a bill of materials. The outflows were not dramatic. That was the first thing he noticed. They were calm. 200 here, 400 there, a wire to a vendor account that had a name similar to one she'd mentioned before, but not quite the same. $900 in February, $1,500 in April. A pattern building the way a foundation settles, slowly, invisibly, until the crack appears. Over 18 months, $47,000 had left the joint account in increments, no single one of which was large enough to require a conversation. He forwarded the statements to his own email address from a laptop she didn't know he owned, and filed them in a folder he created that evening. He named the folder Viridian. He was not angry, he was clear. Those were different things. The following week, he arranged a conversation with a data forensics firm his company had used for contract disputes. He gave them what he had and asked for a complete picture. They had it in 10 days. A detailed account of the holding company, the timeline of its formation, and the name Dorian Hecht appearing on registration documents 8 months before Vivian had mentioned needing a COO, which meant she had planned the company structure, including its financial architecture, before she had ever discussed it with him as a going concern. The Range Rover's plates were registered to Dorian Hecht, who lived in Dilworth, who held an MBA from Georgetown, and who had been listed on Viridian Group's corporate filings as a 30% stakeholder. He was also listed as the secondary signatory on the Cayman holding account. Marcus sat with this for a full day before he called anyone. He walked through the house that evening while Vivian was at a dinner, and he put his hands on the doorframe of the kitchen he'd rebuilt, and he thought about his grandfather's boat and what the hull had looked like when the old man finally showed him what he'd been sanding toward. Smooth and unbroken and ready. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Monroe. Real power operated in quiet rooms. Patricia Monroe had been a family law and civil litigation attorney for 26 years and had an office in Noda with botanical prints on the wall and a desk that was always cleaner than it should have been for someone who handled what she handled. She was 61, methodical, and had the particular quality of stillness that Marcus recognized in people who had seen enough to stop being surprised. She read through what he brought her without expression. The bank records, the forensic report, the corporate filings, the photographs, the timeline his own analyst had built, which accounted for every wire transfer and cross-referenced it against Viridian Group's reported revenues, revealing a discrepancy that suggested money had been moving through the Cayman account in both directions, out from the joint account and back in as consulting income reported under Dorian Hecht's personal LLC. She's been laundering marital assets through a structure that looks like a legitimate business arrangement, Patricia said, not as an accusation, just as a fact, the way you would describe the load-bearing capacity of a beam. The intent was to reduce your claim in divorce proceedings by converting joint assets into what would appear to be separate business income. "What's my position?" Marcus asked. "Excellent," she said, "especially given what you've already done." She was referring to the acquisition. 3 weeks before this meeting, Marcus had completed the purchase of Viridian Group's primary commercial lease contract, the anchor contract that represented 60% of the firm's annual revenue, through a holding company he had established 18 months ago under the name Ellison Capital Holdings. The contract had come to him through a business broker and had been on the market for 6 weeks. The seller was a commercial real estate investment trust that held the service agreement and had wanted to exit. Marcus had used personal capital that had never touched the joint account, capital he had been building quietly for a decade through investments Vivienne had shown no interest in and therefore no knowledge of. He had not known, when he made the purchase, the full shape of what she was doing. He had known enough. Patricia set the folder down and folded her hands on the desk. "She is going to file shortly. My read, based on the timeline, is that she's waiting until the Q4 numbers close, so she can show peak valuation on Viridian. She wants a clean picture of the company at its highest point, before you can claim it's marital property." "And when she files," Marcus said, "what does she find out?" "That her anchor contract is already yours," Patricia said. "That Ellison Capital Holdings has a right of service assignment. That Viridian Group's primary revenue stream answers to you." She allowed the smallest pause. "She will have filed for divorce against the man who owns her company's future." She had no idea. Marcus drove home that night through the lit streets of Charlotte, and he thought about a thing his grandfather had said about building. Not about wood this time, but about sequence. "You can't skip steps," the old man had told him. "Every part holds the next one. Rush the pour, and the whole thing shifts." He had applied that to everything he'd ever built. He applied it now. 3 days passed. He was careful and quiet. He ate dinner with Vivienne on Tuesday and answered her questions about his week, and listened to her talk about a vendor in Greensboro, and washed the dishes afterward, and did not look at her the way a man looks at someone he has finished grieving. He had finished grieving. That part was done. What remained was the work. On Thursday, his Uncle Gerald came by the house while Vivienne was at her office. Gerald was 68, a retired civil engineer who had helped Marcus get his first job out of NC State, and who had known Marcus's mother for 40 years before she passed, and who was one of 3 people on earth whose judgment Marcus trusted without qualification. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and read what Marcus showed him with the same quiet attention he'd always brought to a set of plans. "She built something real," Gerald said, setting the papers down. "That's what makes it hurt. She was capable of doing it right, and chose not to." "I know," Marcus said. "You sure you want to be the one holding that contract? That's going to make things complicated when it lands." "Complicated for who?" Marcus said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his nephew with something that wasn't pity and wasn't satisfaction, just recognition. "Your grandmother used to say that the hardest thing about being patient is that everybody thinks you're not paying attention." "Let them think that," Marcus said. Preparation was the work. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 11 days after Vivian filed. Her attorney was a man named Greer, pressed and polished, who had the look of someone accustomed to the other side not being prepared. Vivian sat across the table in a charcoal blazer. Not the same one, but similar, because that was the suit she wore when she wanted to project precision. And she set a folder in front of her with both hands and looked at Marcus with an expression that had already decided how this would go. Patricia sat beside Marcus. An additional chair held Warren Gale, Marcus's business partner of 9 years, who had agreed to attend at Patricia's request as a witness to certain documentation. Greer opened by outlining Vivian's position regarding the marital estate, Viridian Group's valuation as a going business concern, and her proposed division of assets. He was thorough and measured, and Vivian kept her hands folded on the table in a way that she had practiced, and for the first 4 minutes it looked exactly the way she had planned it to look. Then Patricia placed a set of documents on the table. She did not narrate them at first. She simply set them out, one at a time, the way you lay a foundation, deliberately, without rushing, letting each piece sit before the next one joined it. The forensic accounting report, the holding company filings, the wire transfer timeline, the Cayman account documentation, the corporate registration records showing Dorian Hecht as a signatory 8 months before Vivian had mentioned needing a COO. Greer's posture shifted slightly. Vivian's hands unfolded. "The marital estate," Patricia said, "includes assets that Mrs. Ellison attempted to reclassify as separate business income through a structure designed specifically to reduce Mr. Ellison's claim. The forensic record is complete and admissible." She set the final document on the table, the acquisition record for Ellison Capital Holdings, dated 3 weeks prior, signed and notarized, listing the Viridian Group anchor contract as a transferred asset. Mr. Ellison completed this purchase through personal capital established prior to and separate from the marital estate. Ellison Capital Holdings is the current contract holder of Viridian Group's primary service agreement, representing approximately 60% of the firm's annual operating revenue. The room was quiet. Vivian looked at the document. She looked at it the way you look at a staircase that is no longer there. "Marcus," she said. Her voice had found a register he'd heard before, soft, directed, meant to remind him of something she thought he was still holding on to. "Whatever you think happened, we can talk about this. We built things together. You know that." Patricia spoke before Marcus could. "Mrs. Ellison, the time for that conversation was not in this room." Vivian looked at Marcus then, directly, and he looked back at her with the same steady calm he'd maintained for 11 months and $47,000, and every Sunday morning and Tuesday dinner and ordinary Wednesday in between. He was not angry. He was clear. "You picked the wrong foundation to build on, Viv," he said. "I know how to inspect them. I know exactly how they fail." He stood, gathered the folder Patricia slid toward him, and he walked out of the room without looking back. The door settled closed behind him with the quiet click of a thing built to fit. She had no idea it would end like this. 8 months later, Marcus Ellison pressed the last board into place on the deck of a craftsman house he'd renovated on a half-acre lot in Belmont, just west of Charlotte. And he stood back and looked at what he'd built and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done right. The deck was Douglas fir, sealed and tight, facing a yard where he'd planted a Japanese maple in October that had already shown its first spring color. A deep burgundy at the leaf edges that caught the morning light like something deliberate. He had a partner now, quietly. Her name was Celeste, a structural architect he'd worked with briefly on a civic project 2 years ago, who asked good questions and had no interest in performing for anyone. She was in the kitchen when he came inside, drinking coffee and reading a contract brief, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked up at him with an expression that was simply glad he was back inside. Ellison Capital Holdings had expanded. The Viridian anchor contract had rolled into a broader portfolio management arrangement that Marcus had restructured over 6 months into a sustainable service group now generating revenue separate from his primary construction work. Warren had called it elegant. Patricia had called it documented. Marcus had called it Tuesday. From a third party, Gerald, who still knew people who knew things, Marcus heard about Vivian in the way you hear news about weather in a city you used to live in. She had closed Viridian Group by February, the revenue structure having collapsed when the anchor contract transferred. She was in Greensboro now, working in a mid-level administrative capacity for a commercial property firm. Dorian Hecht had relocated to Atlanta following his own legal complications, the details of which had not been disclosed, but which Patricia had described as consequential. Vivian's network, the dinners and the industry contacts and the colleague relationships she'd maintained for years, had contracted sharply in the months after the mediation, the way networks do when the full shape of a thing becomes visible. Her mother had not spoken to her since January. He'd heard that too. He registered it the way he registered all of it, without pleasure, without mourning, and then he moved on. He poured his coffee at the kitchen counter and took it out to the new deck and stood in the early morning with the Japanese maple going deep red in the peripheral of his vision and the yard still cool and quiet and entirely his. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.